This morning, I attempted to learn a new song for you guys, and I realized I don't know how to play the guitar, so I'm not going to be able to do that. Unfortunately, what I am able to do is talk a little bit about this thing called the New Deal. You guys, from what I understand, like to play this game called, I think it's called Uno. I don't know. I don't play it. I don't know. But either way, we have this Uno game, and it's always nice when you get a new deal, because especially if you're getting bad cards in the old deal. So the old deal in this case, this kind of metaphor that I'm currently getting lost in, was under the Hoover administration, or maybe even the Republicans of the 1920s that didn't really benefit farmers very much. So we have President Franklin Roosevelt now, who becomes president in 1933. And he offers this new deal to the American people. It's going to take the place of old policies. It's going to expand government larger than government has ever been expanded before. It's going to transform the United States and its system of federalism in a way that had never been done before. And the national government's going to take a bigger role in everybody's life. One thing that you could say about President Franklin Roosevelt is that we know he's an important president because he impacts our lives today. We know that important presidents do that. I mean, if we didn't have George Washington, we may not have a democratically elected president every 4 to 8 years. If we didn't have Abraham Lincoln, we wouldn't have the emancipation of slaves, or at least it wouldn't have been done as early as it was. He impacts people today. Franklin Roosevelt impacts people today because of government programs that are in place during economic hardships, or when people retire, whatever it is. And a lot of this came as part of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies that took place. He impacts our lives today. I don't know if we can say that about Franklin Pierce. I don't know if we can say that about William McKinley, but we can say that about George Washington, or Abraham Lincoln, or Teddy Roosevelt, or FDR. We know that these people are important for that reason. And so FDR and the New Deal policy is going to last from when he starts his presidency in 1933, and it'll go all the way through 1939, really, with the official beginning of World War II, when Germany invades Poland. So if we talk about FDR kind of in general, my painter's tape here was over his name, but FDR was an extremely gifted politician in a lot of different ways. First of all, he has a very warm, calming personality. And during very tense, difficult times, people would tune in to his, fireside chats and be able to feel all nice and cozy knowing that Mr. Roosevelt's going to save them all. And that would, of course, be broadcast over the radio that a lot of people bought during the 1920s, when people were buying lots of things. And he also had a very active First Lady in Eleanor Roosevelt. Their personal relationship was not good, but their professional relationship was strong. And you really had two very strong people who were representing the United States and going around and helping people out, or at least making them feel like they were going to be taken care of. And so President Roosevelt, when he became president, worries about, looks at his first 100 days. Now, President Roosevelt is famous for his first 100 days in office. And you hear this now with presidents today. They talk about what they're going to accomplish in their first 100 days. Well, this comes from President Franklin Roosevelt, because what he does is he calls a special session of Congress. Back then, Congress wasn't necessarily in session during a president's first 100 days in office. Well, he calls a special session of Congress in order to worry about that first R, that relief aspect of the New Deal. And so the special session of Congress comes in, and He is one. They passed through more legislation during that 100 days than I believe any other president has ever throughout an entire presidency. So the one thing he does is he realizes, well, there's a problem with the banks. Overall, you remember during the Great Depression, 9,000 banks went out of business. People were afraid to put their money into banks. They were hiding their money under their mattresses. It was so bad. So he had to restore confidence in the banking system. And so during this bank holiday, all banks were closed for a period of time. And the government would look at the books at all the banks and decide which banks could reopen. This is going to restore faith in the banking industry, and you're going to have some subsequent government programs like an independent government corporation called the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that is going to insure people's money in their savings account. So today, if you have a banking account and it says at that bank, insured by the FDIC, and always look for that, make sure that your money is insured, then as long as you have under $250,000, which I assume, I know I have less than $250,000 in the bank, and I assume that probably at least half of you have fewer than $250,000 in the bank. If your bank goes out of business, you can rest assured that you will get a check from the national government. So you don't have to worry about what a lot of these people during the Depression worried about. And what we see during this New Deal is this alphabet soup, which, by the way, can get kind of confusing on the AP exam. So if you can kind of think main ideas and know a few of these, it definitely would be helpful to you as I go through some of these different agencies with these different initials or acronyms. And so one is the CCC, which is the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the CCC were employing young men to do government projects. So you would get a government paycheck. So these were government jobs. The AAA, not to be confused with AAA today. The AAA back then was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and this is federal subsidies to farmers to not farm. So to try to further eliminate the problem of overproduction that the farming industry had been suffering since the 1920s, we see the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act, trying to resolve during this time period. The National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, NIRA, was money for industry. So it was kind of like subsidies for industries, kind of like how the AAA gave subsidies to farmers and farms. They did the same thing there to try to make sure that you didn't have a bunch of factories closing or even incentivize factories to open up. And the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is today, again, still around, they were primarily located in the Tennessee River Valley, and that was one of the poorest regions of the United States. And this employed people in that particular area to build things like dams and power plants to give people jobs, to try to mediate some of the mass poverty that was going on in that particular section of the country around Tennessee. So President Roosevelt's first New Deal, remember his first New Deal, 1933, 1934, was the first couple of years of his presidency, and it was focusing in on that first R, relief of the New Deal. So relief to people. One of the more controversial things that President Roosevelt did, and this is something that some people are still a little bitter about today, especially if you're talking to a libertarian. I guess talk about that in AP government next year. But it was the Gold Reserve Act, where essentially the federal government seized all the gold. Remember back to when J.P. Morgan had to lend the federal government gold during the Gilded Age? Well, this was something that President Roosevelt did not want to have to experience. So the federal government bought people's gold. You had to go turn in your gold, and you would get an exchange of dollars for that. The Security and Exchange Commission, this is also part of the alphabet soup. It's called the SEC, Security and Exchange Commission, regulates the stock market. Remember, in the 1920s, one of the causes of the Great Depression was the stock market crash that was caused by an unregulated Wild West type of stock market. Well, now the SEC looks and sees if people are doing things like insider trading or improperly propping up companies. And so the SEC can step in and prosecute people for insider trading. People, you would go to prison for that if a group of you got together and said, let's buy this today and let's sell it tomorrow. Stock price artificially rises. You get more value for your stock. And I am not restarting a video for a phone call. I'm too far in. I'm committed at this point. It's just going to keep on going on. So people now can have confidence that the stock market is regulated and it's not as risky as it once was. Because remember, it had a 90% drop off during the Great Depression. 90% drop off in stocks in terms of price, 90% drop off in terms of investors in the stock market. The Wagner Act, National Labor Relations, they look to incentivize people to join unions. So we would see union membership soar during the Great Depression, and by the time we get to the end of the Great Depression and World War II, the union membership is going to skyrocket. And basically, by 1930, when Hoover was in office, there was 1 million people who were in unions because the union membership was very low during the 20s. And so 1 million people by 1930 were in unions. By 1945, by the end of World War II, there were 16 million people in unions. So we see a skyrocketing of 16 times the amount of people in unions. Even before World War II and before the economy had completely recovered, towards the tail end of the Great Depression in 1938, you still had about 9 or 10 times the amount of people that were in unions comparatively to 1930, when the Great Depression just was starting. So also we have the Indian Reorganization Act, which is a movement in the right direction for Native Americans in the United States. Clearly, this was a new deal for them as well, where there was land that was returned to them that was seized by the federal government, money that was given to Native Americans and Native American tribal organizations, and also money for Native Americans for education, whether it be to give money for schools on reservations or Native American lands, or whether it be in the form of scholarships for colleges. So definitely a positive thing there. 21st Amendment was passed through. Well, the federal government needed money, so one way to make money was to make it legal once again for alcohol to be consumed and bought and purchased and manufactured in the United States. And so this is the only amendment, the 21st Amendment, to repeal a previous amendment, the 18th Amendment. And so now it's legal again and you can tax it. It's called a sin tax. We live in Las Vegas. We know a little bit about sin taxes in this town on gambling and things. Well, alcohol, when you tax that, it's a sin tax, and you can and the federal government will make money off of that. So this is another way for the federal government to bring in revenue. So the end of Prohibition takes place during the New Deal too. The second New Deal takes place from 1933 to 1934, focusing more on the second R, recovery. And so the federal government would give out loans to small farmers and the Resettlement Administration so that people would go back to work on farms, maybe people who had lost their farms during the Depression or during the 1920s. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, employed 3.4 million people to do things like to make cities, make murals in cities, or to build athletic facilities. This was artistic, it was athletic. There were lots of different things in order to kind of prop up the morale of people in the United States. The WPA would employ people to do those things. So artists would be hired even through the WPA. The Rural Electrification Administration would look to bring electricity out to areas of the country that had never had it before, in rural areas. So to build up infrastructure, sort of things were important during this time period. And the Fair Labor Standards Act was a way to help the average worker by increasing the minimum wage and overtime pay. Finally, for this set of notes, New Deal opposition, not everybody was in favor of it. Fiscal conservatives would not be in favor of New Deal because it drastically expanded the size of government, and they would call that these unnecessary programs that were passed through during the New Deal so-called boondoggles. So if you were to say pay somebody to paint a big mural in a city, that might be called a boondoggle by a fiscal conservative, a waste of resources and government money, taxpayer money sort of thing. Some people wanted more. Father Charles Coughlin advocated for full-out socialism. Problem for Coughlin, turns out, is that he was also anti-Semitic. He was essentially advocating for Nazism, so that kind of reduced his popularity in the United States. Another person that was advocating for more was Senator Huey Long, who prior to Andrew Yang, he didn't come up with the idea of a universal basic income. Huey Long came up with that idea, or at least really popularized it during the Depression era, where he was promising $5,000 per family and then $2,000 annually. So this was, he was way ahead of his time, but then he would be assassinated. So that would be the end of Huey Long. He challenged FDR, and the Democratic Party challenged him to be more liberal than he was. And FDR was by far the most liberal president at that point of American history. Okay, that is the end of this video, part 1 of the New Deal.